Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, I was thinking we should start with some Iran updates because there's a lot of weird churn out there that it could be connected, it could not, but it's worth, I think, ticking through some of it. So on Sunday, Iranian state TV reported that the U.S. and the U.K. had agreed to a prisoner exchange with Iran that would have involved like trading some Americans for some Iranians and then billions of dollars in cash. Biden's team quickly denied those reports, but it did kind of make my ears perk up and wonder if maybe there are prisoner release discussions happening. Separately, an outlet called Iran Wire reported that officers from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, raided President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif's offices. Apparently, this was part of an investigation into a leak of an interview that Foreign Minister Zarif did where he was critical of the IRGC. We talked about that last week if you want more information about it. Third, Politico published a story that included just unbelievably annoying quotes from Senator Bob Menendez, the Democratic chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he seems to question whether any diplomatic agreement with Iran can be trusted at all because of the aforementioned rivalry between the elected leaders in Iran and the IRGC. And then, in the piece, Menendez asks all these rhetorical questions about the substance of what a new JCPOA might look like, which is sort of annoying to me and odd since I bet he could get those questions answered literally anytime he wants by the White House. On Sunday, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, seemed to tamp down expectations about a deal, saying the two sides are still pretty far apart. So, Ben, a lot of stuff there. Look, my takeaway is it was very frustrating to have Republicans in this Politico story explicitly saying they're trying to block diplomacy by Biden, and then you have Menendez kind of helping them from the Democratic side. There's also reports in the news about meetings between senior Saudi and Iranian officials about maybe diffusing tensions between those two countries. How are you feeling about the prospect of re-entering the Iran deal these days? Like, how are you grading this?
I mean, I feel pretty good about it, much better than like a month ago when we were raising some alarm bells. Clearly, there's pretty intensive negotiations going on. And Tony Blinken was just in the UK. I'm sure this was a key topic of discussion. And even that leak that we saw that you mentioned that was on like a kind of pro-Hezbollah television station, it does kind of suggest that there's an awareness that an end game of negotiations is beginning. Because how I read that leak, Tommy, is that may be the hardline Iran negotiating position. And the IRGC may be leaking that because they want to box in the Iranian negotiators to try to get that. That kind of stuff happened before when we were negotiating with the Iranians. So it's weirdly a sign that they've probably made some progress. So I think we're on the precipice here of potentially like the most consequential thing that the Biden team has done in terms of foreign policy, up there with Afghanistan, of course. On the Menendez thing, I mean, I share your extreme frustration here. And look, just to deal substantively with his concerns that he's expressed, okay, yes, the IRGC does wield a lot of power in that system. But what's so ridiculous about all these rhetorical questions and expressing all these doubts is that we've seen the deal implemented.
Right.
like 5 years ago when the deal was negotiated and implemented, the very same concerns were raised about, well, could they really deliver? Could they really follow through? Would the IRGC be a spoiler? And lo and behold, we have a 2 or 3 year period when the U.S., before Trump pulled out of the deal, where Iran fully complied, verified by the IAEA, the international agency that monitors the deal, by the U.S. intelligence community and military that reported as much to Congress. So these concerns have been addressed in the real world. Yeah. It's not a hypothetical where you need to ask these kind of probing, ponderous rhetorical questions to prove what a hawk you are. We have a track record that shows that as complicated as the Iranian system is, they have stuck to a deal in the past when the United States was in the deal. And it was only when Trump pulled out that the Iranians started to violate the deal here. I also think that all this activity, and you mentioned the strange IRGC power play there, reminds you that there's a lot of moving parts here because there's an Iranian election coming up. And all the more reason to try to just get this deal locked in and in place. Because if you can, and if you miss this opportunity and the window closes, and then you go into an election where the hardline Iran is going to make a hard push, you could find yourself with much less running room come summer or fall here than you have right now, where there is this window where you can get something done. So positive signs, but again, the hardest push is yet to come. And look, Democrats in Congress need to get in line with this. I mean, there's nothing to be gained from proving your hawkish bona fides by expressing lukewarm support or mild opposition to something that works, that takes the Iranian nuclear issue off the table. And look, you're never going to be as hawkish as the insane Republican rhetoric that we're going to hear about whatever Biden does here. Don't undercut a Democratic president in his first year trying to do something that the previous Democratic president also did that worked, I think people should, we say it's on domestic policy, but should be pressuring Democratic members of Congress to stop this performative questioning and realize that this is by far the best option available.
Yeah, it's so we'll talk about North Korea in a little bit, but it's so frustrating to think back to when Trump was engaging with those talks with Kim Jong-un, and the sort of polls of the debate were Lindsey Graham on the super far right asking Congress to authorize the use of military force against North Korea to backstop the negotiations, and we can't even get the senior Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee to just full-throatedly come out in support of diplomacy to solve a problem when there's a very clear track record of it working a couple of years ago. It just drives me nuts.
Yeah, and what's also frustrating about this is that when Trump was in office and he pulled out of the JCPOA and the results were clearly so terrible, the Democratic caucus was pretty united in being critical of Trump. Yeah. And even opponents of the deal, Chuck Schumer, who's now the majority leader, were very critical of Trump. Well, was that just anti-Trump politics?
Right.
There are actually a lot of commentators, including some Republican commentators, Max Boot, hardly a progressive Democrat, who were I was a critic of the Iran deal, but it worked and it's the best of all these different options. You can do that. Even people who oppose the deal, right? Like Ben Cardin and Chuck Schumer can say, look, we saw the deal implemented and it worked. And we had concerns before the deal about whether Iran would stick to their obligations, but there's a track record of this working. Don't allow this. The more Democrats, oppose this or express all concerns about it, the bigger of a political story this becomes. And the bigger problem it is for Joe Biden and the more of a drag it is on him. Make this as simple as possible. The Republicans are going to oppose this. The Democrats, by and large, support it, and I think should give it strong support. Biden should come back in the deal, and we can all move on knowing that of all the many issues that Joe Biden has to deal with as president, the Iranian nuclear issue, for at least the first term, would be taken care of if this deal is returned to and implemented.
Yes, knock on wood. Let's hope they have some success in these talks. I want to turn to a Washington mystery that we've been hearing about a lot over the past few years, which are these periodic reports about U.S. officials serving abroad coming down with mysterious illnesses. It started with embassy staffers in Cuba in 2016 who experienced vertigo, headaches. They heard piercing noises. Then there were reports of similar incidents happening to diplomats or CIA personnel in places like Russia and China. And then last week, CNN reported that the U.S. is investigating a similar incident with an NSC staffer who I guess felt sick near the White House. And then there was another similar incident with a White House staffer who was walking her dog in Virginia. So obviously it's a big deal if this is some sort of attack, if it's now happening in the U.S., let alone right by the White House. It was near the Ellipse where people used to park. So one of the theories about why people are feeling sick is that some adversary, potentially Russia or China, is using a weapon that harms people by directing microwave energy at them. CNN reported that Trump's team put the Department of Defense in charge of investigating these incidents because I guess the government felt like the State Department and the CIA weren't taking it seriously enough. Politico also, in a long piece about this, talks about the challenges of diagnosing these illnesses, including some false alarms. I guess there were some guys serving in Syria who felt sick after a jog, and there was a Russian helicopter nearby, and they thought it might be that in a directed energy attack. But then they realized it was food poisoning. So there's a lot of room for false positives here, especially when you start to think this must be happening because someone's attacking us. The former acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, said he views this as an act of war. Politico also reported that defense officials have told Congress they think it is Russia that is the source of the attacks. And they're also getting worried about this happening overseas in places like Syria or Afghanistan. Ben, we've been talking about these incidents for 5 years now. I still have no idea what to make of them. For a while, this was branded the Havana syndrome. You've pointed out many times that this was blamed on Cuba and used as a pretext to roll back Obama's opening there. What do you what's your sense of what's happening these days? And do you think there's, just to ask the direct question, is there any chance the Cubans have the capacity to do this in D.C.? Can we rule that out yet?
There's zero chance. There's 0.0 chance that the Cubans have the capacity to do this in DC, in China, where it's been reported, in the Middle East. I mean, the two things I'd say about this are like, clearly a lot of this feels like Russia, and I know there's a lot of, there's been a lot of stuff thrown at the Russians over the years, but everything I've heard out of the government, points to the Russians. People now have begun to say that publicly. And the reality is it's of a piece, right? They have harassed U.S. diplomats. They have done things in third countries like poison people, right? This would be an incredible violation of just how nations interact, because if they're trying to so mess with the United States that they're trying to create this fear, or this sense that you're not safe anywhere, that's something that we've never seen before. We didn't see it in the Cold War, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Like, this idea that they would basically violate the capacity of nations to even conduct diplomacy and operate overseas. I think the U.S. would have to take that incredibly seriously and mobilize a global coalition of countries to go to the Russians and just like, look, this is a line that cannot be crossed here. And there's going to have to be a very strong multilateral response to this if we can lay out the evidentiary basis that it was Russia. I want to say something about the Cuban piece of this. This was, because this is a huge scandal in my mind. This should be a big scandal. The Democrats have control of Congress. They should investigate this, because what happened is, when this originated in Cuba, the Trump people jumped on it, as you referenced, used it to essentially shutter our embassy in Havana, yank out so much staff that we essentially can't even process visas in Havana, to roll back Obama's policy changes. I mean, there's two huge problems with that. The first is, that's a huge scandal if they knew that there was evidence that suggested this wasn't the Cubans, and this was much bigger than Havana, because they were so intent on appealing to their hardline Cuban-American base in South Florida that they basically invented a story that this was the Cubans. That's insane. Like, that put people at risk around the world. Like, I mean, I really, really, really want the congressional committees that are in the hands of Democrats to pull the thread on this, because if you can establish that the Trump people were aware and investigating and asking the Pentagon to investigate that whether the Russians were doing this, while essentially the public-facing story was that this was in Havana, this must have been the Cubans somehow, therefore we're going to roll back Obama's policies, that is a grotesque politicization of national security that I think kind of goes even beyond just about every Trump scandal that we've seen to date. And the other thing is, and you're going to hear me talking about this more and more, Tommy, there is a humanitarian crisis in Cuba right now because of the sanctions that Trump put on them that does not get enough attention. That is entirely because of U.S. sanctions. Their economy is in the worst shape that it's been since 2005. It contracted by over 10% last year. The World Food Program is warning of food shortages for Cuba. People starving. Wow. There's the risk of mass migration from Cuba, people trying to cross the Florida Straits on makeshift rafts again back into the United States, people migrating to Mexico. And look, the Biden team has been terrible on this issue so far, not just in not doing anything, but in the language that you see coming out of the White House. Basically, it's like, yeah, this isn't important. It's not a priority. What about, I get that it's politically difficult, but what about the humanitarian crisis that is happening 90 miles from Florida here? The pretext for which was something that we now know was probably totally false, that the Cubans launched these attacks. So,
wow, I didn't know it was that bad. Those are some really jarring stats.
Yeah, it's not good. And it doesn't get attention because it's a small island, but, someone needs to be raising it. But again, like if Rex Tillerson and all these people in the Trump administration essentially hid behind the Havana syndrome to justify a pointless rollback of these policies under Obama, that's beyond cynical. That's criminally negligent because it put our people in harm's way in other parts of the world.
Yeah, Rex Tillerson, who was busy firing half the State Department staff before getting fired himself while apparently on the toilet, which we learned. I want to turn to another sort of like major issue Biden's going to have to deal with, which is North Korea, because the Biden team announced that they had conducted a 3-month review of North Korea policy, finished it, and then Jen Psaki offered some sort of general outlines of the new approach. And Ben, I saw a few different takes on like the little that they'd put out, and I was curious what you thought. So some of the reporting focused on the fact that it sounds like Biden isn't looking for one big grand bargain with North Korea that solves all the problems, and he instead is open to cutting incremental deals and more dialogue. One outlet called the policy a rebuke of both Trump and Obama, because, of course, the important thing about a plan to get rid of nuclear weapons is whether or not it's a sick burn. Vox noticed that Jen used the phrase denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and not denuclearization of North Korea, meaning Biden kept the phrasing that Trump and Kim Jong-un signed at the 2018 Singapore summit. That phrasing is important because it suggests that an ultimate deal could include North Korea getting rid of its nukes and U.S. troops leaving the Korean Peninsula, so much more of a reciprocal thing. Did anything jump out at you about this, what little policy language was laid out that seemed new or big or different?
I mean, from what I heard, it sounds like exactly the right approach on an issue where, let's face it, it's going to be very hard to make progress. I mean, what I heard in the description of the policy from Jen and from Tony Blinken was, this idea that they're open to diplomacy. They're not going to be so stubborn that they're just going to close the door and do all sanctions. I think there was a very appropriate, essentially diplomatic path laid out where this is available. I think the idea of incremental steps is really the only practical approach here. The North Koreans are not, in the next 4 years, in the first term of Joe Biden, just going to come out and give up every piece of their nuclear program. So the idea that what you're aiming for is not the kind of huge splashy thing that Trump was aiming for, which obviously didn't achieve much at all, if anything, but rather kind of some step-by-step process where you're slowing and hopefully reversing pieces of the North Korean program in exchange for some confidence-building measures from the U.S. That's the right approach. And the language about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula is good because, it's about, that was the language that's been used, previously. There was some language that we flagged on this show about, denuclearizing North Korea that sounded unusual to me because what you're trying to uphold is the norm against proliferation generally,
Yeah.
And so, it's not just that we don't want the North Koreans to have nuclear weapons. We don't want, the Korean Peninsula, whether it's the Republic of Korea or North Korea, to have nuclear weapons. So from what I heard, it's the right approach. There, obviously, it's going to be hard. We should, you get graded on a curve on North Korea because it's not easy to get results, but this feels like the right place for them to land.
Yeah, the best curve to get graded on, Donald Trump discovered, which was you just hold some dumb meeting in front of a lot of cameras, and people give you credit for not even coming close, not even beginning to solve the problem. But
it's amazing how much
it's
attention
so funny
that got for no reason. Like literally nothing changed because of that summit.
Nothing.
If you had not held that summit, I don't think anything would be different today than because of that summit being held. So
no. And of course, the North Koreans did what they always do, which they took umbrage at them getting barely mentioned in Biden's joint session speech. But so far I haven't seen a big response. But we'll be watching this one, unfortunately, I think for a long time. Yeah. Let's turn to Israel because Israel announced a day of mourning and an investigation into a really horrifying incident that killed, I've seen estimates of up to 45 people at a holy site in northern Israel. So an estimated 100,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews were at this holy site for a festival. And tragically, as they were trying to exit, some people slipped and they fell in this narrow passageway. And then others were trying to exit above them and it ended up crushing all these people as everyone was trying to exit out of the same narrow passage. A lot of Israelis are furious that previous warnings about safety at this specific site have been ignored. I think this sort of folds into a broader frustration about, a feeling that some ultra-Orthodox Israelis live by a different set of rules, and then politicians let them do things like host this massive festival when COVID isn't fully eradicated, basically because they need their votes, right? There's no check on that behavior. I'm sure we'll learn a lot more of what would happen through, future investigations. But really, I just wanted to raise this and offer condolences because it's just it was horrifying, tragic scene and something you don't ever want to see.
The accounts of it were just horrifying. Like the people describing what it was like to be in that crowd. I mean, I couldn't stop reading it, and I feel, condolences to everybody in Israel, and just what a horrific event. And it was also interesting, to read the warnings that have been issued. Though you're right, Tommy.
Yeah.
They were very
specific,
on point. It was there will be a stampede. People
Yes.
will die if you don't address the way in which this site is put together. And it does point to this broader issue that has come up. You've seen this on military service. You've seen this on lots of things in Israeli politics. That the nature of the coalition building that we've talked about a lot, because there have been so many Israeli elections, is such that sometimes these kind of concessions or carve-outs are given to ultra-Orthodox parties or on certain policies. And this is a good example of like why you don't do that. Like it's in the interest of all people to have kind of a common standard for basic public safety. So, right now, like the emotion and the feeling should entirely be about those who lost loved ones and those affected. I do think it is worth, people in Israel taking a look at this again, because, it's not just about whether people are getting preferences. Sometimes it's about public safety. And I should say, like, as we come out of COVID or we're still dealing with COVID, there are going to be different flavors of this challenge. Very different situation because India is in the middle of a horrible outbreak, whereas Israel has done very well with its vaccine program. But you had Hindu pilgrimages taking place.
We talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean,
super spreader events.
I get that people want to, particularly when it's religion, people feel compelled to do something that is in line with their belief system. But, when you look at the circumstance in India too, like, people need to remember we're still coming out of this.
Yeah, and I saw Netanyahu say, look, it's too early. Right now, we should be talking about mourning and not recriminations and who to blame. Felt like every gun rights discussion we have in the U.S. Yeah. And I saw a minister who I think was in charge of the event itself suggesting that what happened was God's will. So I hope that person is fired and that does not go over well. Now, I don't know about you, but like at some point along the way, I actually think it was like a post 9/11 thing for me. I actually started really hating big crowds indoors. Like outdoors, fine. Like baseball game where you could like get onto a field or that's not a big deal. But I remember being at a concert in DC at the Verizon Center and just like scanning for exits at all the time. I might have been, I might have taken like an edible too many, but still the same thing.
I will say that it does
stand.
This is like when I saw this on the pod outline, I was thinking that people are not accustomed to being in big crowds anymore, No. And because this was the first big crowd event, obviously, of this size in Israel. And it did make me wonder whether we will remember how to be in a giant crowd. I mean, I'll give you an example. Inauguration Day, 2009, I didn't have the best ticket. I was in that
I was in the
tunnel.
Purple Tunnel of Doom too.
Yeah, where there's huge crush of people that got stuck in the tunnel. Anyway, these things happen. I guess the word of caution for governments, for worldos, is we're not in good habits of being in huge crowds. So we should be extra careful as we kind of reemerge into the wild here. We have not lived in the wild for a long time. We've all been in the zoo of our homes here. So let's be extra careful.
Yeah, it's just been me, Hannah, and Luca for a little too long. Ben, I want to talk about some really good staffing news for Joe Biden. So first, our friend Samantha Power, confirmed by the U.S. Senate by a vote of 68 to 26. Fuck those 26 people. That's me editorializing, not Sam. She's going to lead the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. In that role, she will be an incredible advocate for getting the world vaccinated, getting U.S. foreign assistance to people who need it. So just awesome news. Great human being. Also, Colin Kahl was confirmed by a vote of 49 to 45 to be Biden's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Somehow, some way, U.S. senators managed to get over their concerns about Colin's past tweets that were mildly critical of Trump administration policies. So, two great people in big jobs. I just couldn't be happier for them and for the country.
Again, we've talked about Colin. It's absurd that 45 people voted against him.
Truly.
It shows you how broken the Republican Party is. But look for him to be the driving force behind a lot of the policy making out of the Pentagon. That's what that role does, the Undersecretary for Policy. And Sam, I mean, just a giant dunk that she got that many votes. That's awesome.
It's a lot of votes.
I mean, she's going to be at the center of a lot of stuff, including this effort to vaccinate people globally. But I also hope that they really elevate her profile. She's an incredible voice around the world. People know who Sam Power is, and they love and respect her, the activist community, the human rights community, and usually the USAID administrator is a pretty low profile figure. I mean, I would use her as a voice, and the fact that USAID's mission is very apolitical, all the better, right? Because Sam Power represents what a lot of people want to see in terms of U.S. leadership around the world, like helping people for the sake of helping people, trying to combat disease, trying to bring electricity to people and have it, trying to combat climate change by helping poorer countries transition to cleaner energy. So I think this is wonderful news, and it really rounds out their team with complementary voices who bring, in some cases more progressive perspectives, or in some cases like Colin, just like deep expertise, but also a willingness to really fight for what you believe in. Colin got in trouble less for being a progressive, but just for being, as we talked about, someone who would fight for the Iran deal. I hope to see a lot of these folks in the public domain, as well as in the room where, as John Bolton says, in the room where it happens.
In the room where it happened. Yeah, no, it's also awesome for the USAID workforce, because they will have like an inspiring boss who will fight for them. Basically, the U.S. government, USAID, just drafted your equivalent of like a David Ortiz, a Nomar Garcia-Parra, a Pedro Martinez. Sam's a big Red Sox fan, so she'll get all of these enormous compliments, but those are some ballers.
Can you imagine having been in the USAID workforce under Trump? I mean, we talked about the State Department. We should have talked more about like the good people of USAID. That must have been brutal.
Yes, truly.
And look, we should talk about development at some point, because there's also some reform that needs to be done, because a lot of these big development projects get farmed out to contractors. And I mean, I think really trying to empower that USAID workforce, that would be a huge asset for Sam to take that on.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Okay, Ben, I want to talk to you about something that was flagged for us by our incredible producer, Jordan Waller, who frankly, she refused to do it. We should just like force her onto the Zoom, because she knows more about this than we do. But there are some reports that officials in Kyrgyzstan said that there was fighting on the border between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan last week that killed 34 people and injured 160. They're really, really awful reports. People's houses were destroyed. Like, I was just watching some Radio Free Europe reports about these funerals. I mean, just awful stuff. These two countries have had frequent skirmishes over disputed land and disputed water resources over the years. But what happened last week was described as the worst fighting between the two countries since they gained independence from the Soviet Union 30 years ago. That independence, by the way, and the lines that the Soviets drew are probably at the root of a lot of these problems. But, this fighting included like civilians, border guards, the Tajik military, so it got very ugly. Al Jazeera reported that it was serious enough that 58,000 people were evacuated from the area. There was concern that the fighting could escalate, but the good news is that a ceasefire has held since Sunday. The presidents of the two countries spoke on Friday. The Russians offered to help mediate. I'm sure that will be welcome. I admit to not knowing much about these two countries, or really like the stand countries generally, but this was kind of scary. This was scary news.
Yeah, I mean, the two things that jumped out to me are just like, we talked a lot about nationalism. I mean, there's a disease of nationalism. These small disputes that are not getting resolved. They're getting kind of ginned up and dialed up, and it can lead to this type of violence. And so it was good to see them turn to dialogue and diplomacy, and hopefully that can lessen the tension. Yesterday was World Press Freedom Day. These are countries that we don't get a lot of window into,
No, especially Tajikistan. Yeah.
Yeah. I was looking around, right? I was trying to find, good information, and you end up finding kind of wire services, like you said, or Radio Free Europe. But there's some very courageous bloggers in these places. Yeah. I think it was just a reminder, like try to seek out and find independent voices who can tell you what's up in these countries. Try to follow them on Twitter, because part of the reason we don't know a lot about these countries is there's not a lot of independent media coming out of there. Yeah. And so what you get are these kind of, I don't know if any world audience may read The Economist. Like, you ever come across like that insert where it's like a 5-page advertisement for like Kazakhstan, in The Economist, but that's kind of like what the media is from these places. It's like these kind of advertisements about the economy or the tourism sector. So just this incident reminded me, like, man, we could use better information, but if you dig, you'll find it, often on Twitter. Frankly, it's one of the things that Twitter is good for. So try to build your own cache of Central Asian bloggers. I'll try to give them some love myself, because it's important that the world understands these places and what they're dealing with.
Yeah, that's a really good call. I noticed that Al Jazeera had some really good in-depth coverage, and then like they threw to a panel that had a guy in the Czech Republic and a woman in London and a dude in Russia, and I was like, holy shit! Like, what an interesting collection of people. How do you source interviews to talk about this conflict that quickly and like get this interesting panel that all speaks English? It was very impressive. Good for Al Jazeera.
Yeah, absolutely, and hopefully, hopefully like there can be more storytelling coming out of these places so that we have a better understanding.
Yeah, and right, and not just sort of like the geopolitics, but like the human beings who are hurting. Ben, speaking of human beings who are frustrated or hurting, I want to talk about some more fallout from the effort to create a European Super League. So on Sunday, Premier League soccer watchers probably saw that about 200 Manchester United fans actually managed to break into Old Trafford, the Man U stadium, and storm the field just hours before the game. It was kind of funny. They were like taking free kicks and stuff. Like some cops got injured outside in the protests, and that's awful. But like, it was kind of motley. It was not as intense as I worried it would be. But these folks were angry about the attempt to create the Super League, which has basically destroyed English Premier League soccer. But they were also voicing longstanding anger and frustration at the Glazer family, who are these like Trump-loving American billionaires who have owned Manchester United since 2005. They also own the Tampa Bay Bucks. And basically fans feel like the Glazers only care about the value of the team as an asset and not the team itself. I was listening to this brilliant soliloquy about what happened that Roger Bennett, the co-host of Men in Blazers podcast, put out the day of. And he was describing this backlash that you're seeing in European football against like the relatively recent influx of money into soccer. And it made me think about how much corporate destruction of sports that we have just kind of acquiesced to here in America, right? So like we talked about the NFL draft earlier, a bad owner like Dan Snyder in Washington can ruin a franchise for decades, right? Like you deal with James Dolan owning the Knicks. Donald Sterling, who owned the LA Clippers, was an overt racist. Fans have to deal with like blacked out TV games, overpriced tickets.
Woody Johnson, Trump's ambassador to the UK, is the Jets owner.
Yes.
Yeah, we're stuck with that guy,
Right. Like you have players that get bought and sold like pawns. There's no regard for their feeling for the fans. Like, I don't know. I wonder, look, I'm not advocating storming the field. I don't want to sound glib about this whole thing. It was a terrible thing to watch. I think it was upsetting for a lot of EPL fans. But I do wonder, like, if fans need to, I don't know, we just sort of like are okay with the fact that sports are a business and that's never going to change. But it doesn't have to be this bad. It doesn't have to be Super League bad.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, spoiler alert, we have more protests coming. I mean, this phenomenon of people just being pissed about the excesses of capitalism is like all over the place. It's global. It's protest against governments, but increasingly it's protest against sports. Again, we've talked about this is something that's important to people's sense of identity.
Yes,
and when they feel like this thing that is like a key part of their identity. I mean, I know people who like if you ask them to list the 3 or 4 things about them, they might say their nationality, they might say their religious or ethnic background. Mm-hmm. They may put the sports team like number 3.
Oh yeah.
Some people may put the sports team number 1,
totally.
Right? This is important to people. And when it's just another commodity, you're just kind of squeezing like a corporate raider, like that's touching people's nerve. And so, there could be more of this kind of protest. Again, not advocating for what happened, but warning more that like, hey, if you don't pay attention to this, we're going to be seeing more of it. The other thing is, because I was thinking like, I think sometimes we can overly glorify some past era of slightly more responsible corporate leadership, Mm-hmm. I guess I'm about to do that.
Go for it.
It used to feel like, sports teams were owned by like business leaders, families from the place where the sports team was,
right.
And so everybody was a kind of all part of the same community. And I'm not saying those people were all saintly, some of them were good owners. And I mean, look, when I was a kid in New York, like George Steinbrenner was hardly like a great guy. Right. But,
right.
The reality though, is I do think that, there used to be more of a sense, whether it was a sports team, a newspaper was owned by like some business person in the locality. As everything has become so globalized and antiseptic and divorced from the kind of lived experience of a community, like you really lose something. You really lose something in terms of like the identity of a place, in terms of, just feeling like everybody has a stake in the success of the team winning, not just the team turning a certain profit. So this is a broader phenomenon. And I would hope we can get back to a place where, whether it's a sports team or any major institution that matters to the identity of a place, that the ownership of that is closer to the people that support it.
Yeah, I mean, look, in this case, Manchester United fans were mad at a guy who literally lives in Tampa, Florida. I mean, he just views his team as an asset. And I think it can't be stressed enough, the fact that this creation of the Super League would have destroyed the English Premier League as they know it now. Like, you would have had lesser teams that rely on the money they make from playing games that get televised against some of the big guys for their existence. And there's a chance they would have gone under, and communities would have lost the team they love, and people would have lost jobs, and like an entire way of life would have gone away for thousands and thousands of fans. And so some little hostage video that your PR firm had you film apologizing to a fan base that you really have no connection to is not going to do it. And like you said, it sounds like these same fans are going to be protesting again next week. So, like, I don't know, like Roger made this point, there's not a lot of benevolent billionaires sitting around with enough cash to buy a team like this. But, it seems untenable to have a fan base that despises the ownership quite this much. Although I guess Washington football team fans might disagree with me there, because they've been in this boat for a while.
So I'm going to veer into a book reference here.
Please.
And I'll give my first book plug of the show. We're within a month of the publication date. So please pre-order. Seriously, actually, when I was exploring why people are turning to nationalism, to kind of right-wing nationalism, one of the things that I heard in Hungary that is totally relevant to this discussion is that people's sense of traditional identity was unmoored by globalization. That as everything got globalized and everything became kind of uniform and it came about capitalism, you had less and less place to turn, less and less firm ground underneath your feet, and so therefore you were riper for an appeal to nationalism, right? And just to draw this out, I'll take it in an American context, right? If your local newspaper doesn't exist anymore, if your local sports team is owned by some billionaire who doesn't live in the city, who only cares about the bottom line, and if your local cultural institution has gone under because nobody's financing the arts anymore, like, human beings need to feel like they belong to something. And so part of the political tribalization that we're facing in America and Europe and many other places is, as people are losing these ties to their more local identities, like, they're more ripe to find belonging online or in a nationalist movement, or in India, as you talked to Rana, in a Hindu nationalist movement, a religious-based movement. These things are weirdly connected. I mean, I'm not stretching here from the Super League to nationalism, because again, like, you take away those things that make people feel rooted and anchored in something, they will try to be rooted and anchored in something else. And that has been a big opening for the Putins and Trumps and Orbans of the world.
Yeah, I was watching this movie on Saturday. It's called Here Are the Young Men. It's this it's a drama with like a lot of, if you liked Peaky Blinders, it's a lot of that cast. It's Anya Taylor-Joy, Finn Cole, a bunch of the guys from it, and it's sort of a story about, it's like these Irish kids who graduate high school and they do a ton of drugs and they party and they get in some trouble. But really, it's like a story about some dark things that happen that revolve around culture and what it's taught them about toxic masculinity. And it keeps flashing to like America and sort of American war culture around Iraq, and then video games, right? And it's like sort of the only connection a lot of these kids had was to these like incredibly violent, meaningless cultural events that just sort of celebrated a view of masculinity that was kind of divorced from the reality of almost anyone's life. Like, there are very few actual soldiers in the US or the UK that like these people were actually looking at. It was like Call of Duty style warfare and violence, right? It was just a very interesting movie and well done and kind of like akin to what you were saying.
Yeah, this cultural space is essential to winning the long-term struggle for democracy, really. Because again, if you cannot offer people a sense of belonging, a sense of community, it's usually gets directed in the wrong place.
Yes. Yeah, things get dark fast.
Yeah, things get dark fast.
So a couple of quick things as we roll through the end of the show. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how the Biden administration seemed to backtrack on its commitment to increase the cap on the number of refugees allowed into the country. Just wanted to close the loop on that and let listeners know that Biden has officially lifted the cap to allow 62,500 refugees into the country through the end of this fiscal year, which I think ends September 30th. The fiscal year thing always screws me up. Though that's not the same as actually getting 62,500 people through the vetting process, through the resettlement process, and into the U.S. So, this whole back and forth was a weird kind of unnecessary policy fumble by Biden, but credit to the team for getting to the right place.
And credit to the activist community for raising so much noise that they backtracked,
Yes, absolutely.
And stay on it because you want to hit that cap and then you want to see it go up to over 100,000 next year.
Yes, absolutely right. And then there's a story you flagged, Ben, which is some really disconcerting news out of El Salvador. So the Salvadorian president, Nayib Bukele, led a successful effort in Congress to purge all of the top judges from the country's Supreme Court. Bukele and his New Ideas Party, they were able to do this because in February, they won the midterm elections and were able to secure a supermajority, which basically allowed them to lead this like purge on the final check on their power, which is the courts. We talked about this back in March, Ben, and sort of fears about this kind of exact kind of power grab would occur. And there's growing concern that Bukele had authoritarian tendencies and might return El Salvador to its time as a military dictatorship. Ben, you had flagged that, I think the NSC staffer in charge of this tweeted about it. I think Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, made some calls. Like, how concerned do you think the Biden team is about these developments?
I mean, you saw Tony call, the day after this was done. I mean, I think they must be really concerned because you cannot deal with the migration issue that they want to deal with without El Salvador being a key part of it. I mean, they're at the center of this. And what's complicated, of course, is, by kind of morphing into something of a right of center autocrat, although his politics are kind of hard to pin down. He has reduced some crime, I think, but like you don't want to fall into the old trap that the U.S. has fallen into in Central America in the past, where, you kind of back someone who's increasingly kind of a right-wing autocrat to serve your interests on this case, migration. In the past, it used to be anti-communism. So I think the Biden team, it's none of this is their fault. Like they're just hard, and I think it points to the fact that they're going to have some really tough trade-offs and they're going to have to try to figure out, well, we need to work with these countries. There's no other way to slow the factors that are driving migration that have also kind of a humanitarian purpose, right? You want to reduce violence, you want to improve standards of living in Central America, but how do you do that while trying to nudge this guy back in a more democratic path? I mean, they have their work cut out for them. Kamala Harris is going to take this on. I think a key part is just showing up down there a lot, sending high-level people, meeting with a cross-section, not just him, but other figures in civil society, and just stay on top of it, so that there's not a perception that so long as you deal with the U.S. interest, in this case on migration, you can kind of do whatever you want. And Tony Blinken, to his credit, his readout of that call was expressing the concern that we had as a country over these steps.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And then so speaking of, I think, regional challenges that they're going to stay on top of, we should talk about Colombia quickly, because tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets in Colombia to protest. Initially, it was a protest about a tax proposal by this right-wing government of President Ivan Duque that the unions and a lot of working class people said this tax policy change would have disproportionately hurt the poor and benefited the rich. This was amazing, Ben. So the finance minister was asked what the price of eggs was, and he answered with a number that was 4 times less than reality. So when you botch a question that bad, you got to resign, and the government actually withdrew the tax plan. But as we've seen so many times in the past year and a half or so, these protests have continued because they weren't just about this tax proposal, right? There's like a list of frustrations with the government, including something we've talked about before, which is anger that the Colombian government might resume aerial fumigation of cocoa crops, which would hurt farmers. There's also been just really horrifying violence from the police against the protesters. Dozens of civilians have been killed. I think the UN even weighed in. So this is another one we're going to keep an eye on. As I think the year of the protest really extends into 2021, and there's no sign of any of this slowing down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, Tommy, I saw the egg thing, and I was thinking that as someone who hasn't left my Venice neighborhood much in the pandemic, the price of eggs at the Erewhon in Venice is like through the roof. So it's like, so I would actually err on the upside, whereas this guy erred on the downside.
Yeah.
But no, in all seriousness, look, I mean, Colombia has been a very unequal country. The only thing I'd add to this is Duque comes out of the party of Alvaro Uribe, who many people think is kind of the power behind the power there in Colombia, right-wing guy. And when you reference this kind of police excess, the part of the legacy of the multi-decade conflict in Colombia with the left-wing guerrilla movement, the FARC, is that there was a creation of these kind of right-wing paramilitary forces that, committed plenty of human rights violations over the years. And there are these kind of I was reading up on these police units. There are these kind of quasi-paramilitary units. There's a legacy there of kind of right-wing security forces that clearly also is a part of the dynamic in Colombia. The reality is there's been huge progress in Colombia over the last decade or two in reducing violence and promoting economic growth, but there's massive inequality, and there's still the legacy of some of these conflicts, including in the police forces. And clearly the Duque has not done nearly enough to try to address that. May not be capable politically given his politics of doing it, but the backtrack was good here. But I think it shows there's this trend we've seen in multiple Latin American countries now of grassroots mobilization. We saw it obviously in Chile to try to address inequality, to try to address kind of structural concerns, including around policing. And I think one thing to watch, and by the way, this is another reason why the Cuba policy, the Biden team kind of thinking they can avoid that is a mistake. Latin America is kind of shifting to the left here. I mean, if you look at Argentina, if you look at Bolivia, if you look at Lula getting out of jail, if you look at this movement in Colombia, the idea that, under Trump, they thought there were all these right-wing guys, Pinera in Chile, you had for a time Macri in Argentina, who's right of center. You had Duque is kind of the guy who Trump.
Bolsonaro.
Bolsonaro. This is shifting. This pendulum is shifting. And I hope the U.S., the policymakers who are thinking about Latin America understand that there's kind of a bit of a mobilization here on the left that we're seeing spread across countries. And it's not the old school one. This is not like the Cubans pulling a bunch of strings. This is like coming from the grassroots.
Yes, well said. There was a CIA recruitment video that went around Twitter that spawned an infinity number of takes. I don't know if you saw this, Ben. So there's a woman featured in this recruitment video talking about being a millennial, talking about being a woman of color. And that made some on the left feel like the CIA was like cynically adopting progressive language, right? And then some on the right suggested that talking about diversity in a recruitment video was somehow weak. This take was epitomized by Senator Ted Cruz of Cancun, who said, quote, "We've come a long way from Jason Bourne," seemingly unaware that Jason Bourne is a fictional character and that the majority of CIA staffers, well over half of the CIA staff spends their days at a desk doing analysis, science and technology, cybersecurity, management. Like there's no Jason Bourne running around with a gun that I'm aware of. So there's ops guys, there's an ops side, and then there's whatever. But most of them are like doing stuff at a desk. So I don't know, Ben, like the whole thing I did not weigh in on Twitter because Twitter is the worst, but why is it so hard to understand that it's a good thing, even if you don't like the CIA? You want them to have a diverse workforce, diverse perspective. You want the entire government to be more diverse, right? Because the old excess of the CIA, guess who was running it? White guys from Yale.
White dudes. Yeah, it's like more. If you're gonna use Matt Damon, let's point to the Good Shepherd, like that's actually the folks who are running the CIA,
right?
Not the Matt Damon in Bourne Identity. Good Shepherd's a pretty good movie. People should check it out, by the way.
It is.
But I think, look, in the second term, Tommy, so this is after you left, but John Brennan and Avril Haines, who was the deputy director of CIA at the time, really prioritized diversity and launched some of these initiatives. I'm sure Trump put the kibosh on all that.
Yeah.
Now Avril is the DNI. Bill Burns, someone who values diversity at CIA, I'm sure. This is good. I mean, we should want, I can't, the quality of the video, I'll leave that to others to judge. But just the basic idea that they're trying to recruit, they're not trying to brainwash people. No. We should want the diversity of America to be reflected in the CIA, in every American institution, in the intelligence community. I've always thought it was a huge, huge missed opportunity for the CIA to not recruit more diverse voices, because you want those perspectives to inform how the United States is interacting around the world, including how we're, what the CIA is doing around the world.
Yes.
And I want to say that this should be about gender diversity and ethnic diversity. It should also be about geographic diversity. And sometimes the CIA has been a little over the top and not trusting diaspora populations who
totally, yes.
I've found to be among the most patriotic Americans, people who are first, second generation immigrant families. So hopefully this is a broad approach to diversity. But yeah, I'm for it, even if the videos are sometimes, the CIA, as much as the CIA has been in the popular culture for a while, they're not very good at doing popular culture themselves sometimes.
No, they're more better behind the scenes players.
Yeah.
Ben, I have two quick outro items, two little Easter eggs for the listener. One is a blanket pronunciation apology that will apply going forward.
Yeah.
I took a lot of shit for, I guess, saying Glasgow, not Glasgow, about the city where the future climate talks are going to be.
I'm sorry too. I'm genuinely sorry, because I know I mispronounce things. I feel terrible about it. I try to do better, but yes, people are right. People are right to give a shit.
You guys should hear Jordan try to fix our pronunciation.
Yeah.
Like, I can hear something perfectly 10 times and then it just erases in my brain. I'm not trying to be a dick. I'm just a schlub from Boston. Also, Jordan points out that this episode drops on Cinco de Mayo, which gives us a chance to do a little well actually about what the holiday actually commemorates. Did you know that Cinco de Mayo commemorates the first Battle of Puebla, which took place between the Mexican army and the French army under the reign of Emperor Napoleon III, who wanted to establish a second Mexican empire more favorable to the French? The Mexican army beat the French, which may have had impacts on the American Civil War, because the French, if they had won, it would have made it easier for them to come and help those asshole Confederates. So Cinco de Mayo, not a popular holiday in Mexico. It's largely celebrated in Puebla, where the battle took place. A lot of Americans think Cinco de Mayo is Mexican Independence Day. It is not. That is September 16th.
I thought it was a day when fraternity brothers drank so much Corona that they threw up on themselves. But
have you had a Corona, Rita?
No, I haven't, but I'll take it on.
So
I will say,
you find them at airports. They're great.
Yeah. Is it
so?
like
It's a margarita when you have like basically a beer. We're now pivoting from the helpful information about what the holiday actually is to the parody of the it's plain and type. But yeah, it's a margarita with a Corona in it. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, the one thing I was going to say, Tommy, because I have some friends and have done some work over the years with Global Citizen, and they put on these concerts to raise awareness and money for things, and this May 8th they're doing what's going to be called Vax Live, which is a concert to kind of generate support and funding and resources for global vaccination efforts. So check it out. I mean, I'm drawn to Eddie Vedder on the list, but you got J-Lo, you got Selena Gomez, you got all kinds of people. So check it out, because they do good work at Global Citizen.
Absolutely. Also, we talked a little bit about Mexican Independence Day, or what it isn't today. In the future, we should talk about the Haitian independence movement and its after effects on the Louisiana Purchase and U.S. history, because I've been reading this book by Clint Smith that is not out yet. I got a galley of it. It's just incredible. It's about sort of this history of a bunch of sites connected to slavery in the U.S. That is just a remarkable book. So I'll give you my copy when I'm done.
Yeah, everybody should read Clint's book, and then also on the Haitian Revolution, Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast.
Yes.
He did like a massive tour through that. I think I plugged it before, but
Yes.
that thing is just
Yeah.
awesome.
Without the Haitian Revolution, we probably wouldn't have made the Louisiana Purchase, because I think the French army was just decimated by illness and by getting their asses kicked. So it's an amazing moment in history. I don't think I was ever taught it.
Nope.
In school.
Nope. Definitely erased. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely erased. Anyway, that's all for the outro. Again, blanket apology on pronunciations. Talk to you next week.